I'd like to welcome everybody to today's presentation on codependency. So what we're going to start out with today is kind of defining codependency and then comparing and contrasting codependency with traits of substance use disorder, or what we would think of as addiction. And then we're going to move into more specific issues for screening for codependency and some different interventions we might be able to use. So codependency can serve as an alternate addiction or a distraction from recovery for people. So you may have somebody who has a substance use disorder who also is codependent. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Codependents must use relationships to try and deal with depression or anxiety. They derive most of their purpose, and we're going to talk about this a lot, from caretaking. Ultimately, codependency is a self-defeating because one of the few things that cannot be controlled is the will of another person. So no matter how much somebody tries to rescue and tries to help, if that person is not willing to engage in treatment behaviors or is not able to do what the codependent wants, then the codependent ends up feeling depressed, anxious, angry, all kinds of dysphoric stuff. Codependency describes a type of relationship in which one partner defines his or her worth or goodness based on someone else. The codependent person often chooses relationships in which the other person needs to be rescued, thereby making himself or herself indispensable. So when we start thinking about it, really thinking about what's going on, what's the purpose? When somebody chooses relationships and really looks for relationships where somebody needs to be rescued, or tends to go to those sorts of relationships, what function is the relationship serving? Is it serving a mutually compatible, self-affirming, building, inspiring function, or is it one because if I don't feel indispensable, then I'm afraid you're going to abandon me? So warning signs that we want to look for. If people have an excessive and unhealthy tendency to rescue and take responsibility for other people. Some of our clients, and codependency isn't a DSM diagnosis, so this isn't something we're going to be seeing a list of criteria for. But when we start talking with some of our clients who have anxiety or depression, a lot of times we may hear signs or we may hear tips that they do tend to get in relationships where they're rescuing and taking responsibility for other people. So we want to help them see, what the function of that is. And when they're looking at, in the big scheme of things, what it creates a rich and meaningful life for them, and how to achieve that, is it that person that they're in a relationship with, or is it being able to nurture and care give, or is it being in some sort of relationship because they're afraid of being alone? So we want to look at who and what is important in this person's life, and how does this relationship where somebody needs to be rescued fit in. They derive a sense of purpose and boost their self-esteem through extreme self-sacrifice to satisfy the needs of others. And if you look at your stereotypical codependent enabler in an addictive family, that person is going to do a lot of covering up for the addict and sacrificing themselves, doing whatever they need to do to keep that perfect facade to the outside and to rescue, buffer, or enable the person who is struggling with the addiction or whatever else. They choose to enter and stay in lengthy, high-cost caretaking and rescuing relationships despite the costs to themselves or others. So again, looking at what's the cost of this. Yes, you feel something, true, but is this something you can only get from this person? And again, what is the function of this behavior? What would happen if you woke up tomorrow and this relationship weren't there anymore? Let's talk about what that would look like. What would it feel like? And how would you manage if this relationship didn't exist anymore? They regularly try to engineer the change of troubled, addicted, or under-functioning people whose problems are far bigger than their abilities to fix them. So they come in going, I will rescue you, I am super person. And you like my little thing there? Okay. Anyhow, but they try to fix it, and they try to manipulate everything. And we know, whether you're a parent or you're a supervisor or somebody's tried to control your behavior, we can't control everybody. We are not working with marionettes here. So they're trying to engineer and change things, but there may be, and likely is, stuff way out of their realm of training, like mental health stuff that needs to be addressed, and interpersonal things, trauma from the past, social skills, job skills. There's only so much that any one person can do. Even a therapist, we have our limits of competence, and then we refer out for other things. And the codependent really wants to do everything. They don't want to let anybody else in, because that might risk the person leaving. They seem to attract low-functioning people looking for someone to take care of them so they can avoid adult responsibility or consequences, or they attract people in perpetual crisis, unwilling to change their lives. And I've even seen this in some colleagues who regularly end up with friends, because they're good listeners. They've been trained to be therapists or peer supporters or whatever. And so people who need help or who are in perpetual crisis often flock to them. The question is how that person handles it, and whether they start self-sacrificing and it starts draining them, or they're able to set healthy boundaries and refer the person out, help them that way. And they have a pattern of engaging in well-intentioned but ultimately unproductive, unhealthy helping behaviors, such as enabling. If your spouse gets a DUI and you happen to be a prominent attorney, and so you make sure that DUI goes away, so your spouse doesn't have to get the DUI on their record. Well, that's well-intentioned. However, now you've potentially called in some favors, you've risked your reputation, and there is no motivation for your spouse to get help necessarily. So looking at what the behaviors were, what the intentions were, and validating, your heart was in the right place. However, is it going to have the outcome you hope? And one of the things that I do with some of my clients is I encourage them to play it out. Okay, your wife got a DUI. You don't want her to suffer the consequences, because it's going to suck, no doubt about it, having to go to a substance abuse assessment and be on probation and anything else that you got to do. There's going to be a lot of hoops to jump through. So I can understand this, and she won't have a driver's license, which is going to cause some problems. But so let's play it through. If you make this charge go away, what's going to happen? Is she going to do it again? Is she going to learn her lesson and spontaneously change? Usually the first time, people think that the other person is just going to learn their lesson and never ever do it again. And then after the second or third time, they're like, yeah, no, heard that song and dance before. And that's what we want. I mean, we want them to, if they feel like they need to reach out the first time and they feel like in their head, heart, and gut, it's the right thing to do, okay, that's your choice. But if you keep doing it time after time after time, I know I had a family member who kept bailing her daughter out of jail time after time after time, and the daughter wouldn't change. I mean, she was just back out doing the same thing. So it's important to be aware of, is the person learning from it? So playing it out. If you make this charge go away again, is she going to change this time, or is she going to go back and do the same thing again and possibly kill herself this time? Okay, so let's play out the other scenario. You let her experience the natural consequences, having to go to court, losing her license, jump through all those hoops. Is that going to change anything? And if the answer is no to both accounts, then treatment's probably an important referral here anyway. However, a lot of times, once the legal system gets involved, in terms of, if we're talking about a person with an addiction, then there's a little bit of motivation to do the next right thing. There's some bite to not following through with what you're supposed to do. So let's look at codependency as an addiction. Tolerance, the need for more of the same substance or activity to get the same feeling. In a codependent relationship, as time passes, the codependent's identity becomes increasingly defined by the relationship with the other person. So if that person goes away, and we'll talk about this down in withdrawal too, they need to be around that person more often, and they need, because they're kind of they're morphing into one person, they're losing themselves. So in order to feel okay, they need to make sure that they're still joined at the hip, so to speak. Withdrawal means not getting the substance. Being around the person results in physical, not being around the substance results in physical or psychological withdrawals. When the codependent is apart from the codependent or from the addict, they're unable to control that person. Generally, if you're not in the same proximity, it's harder to control. Now, they may call them, they may phone stalk them, but it's harder to control them. So they may start getting worried that the person's going to abandon them or make another mistake that they're going to have to clean up. So the codependent starts experiencing extreme anxiety and or depression, because codependents, just as much as people with addictions, tend to need to control everything that they can. They spend more time thinking about, engaging in, or recovering from the behavior. This is a common one in addiction, when people are spending time thinking about their drug or gambling, engaging in gambling, or they're using their drug, and recovering physically, psychologically, and financially from use. Codependents are always hypervigilant to the other people's behavior and obsessing about what they're not doing or what they're doing. So their life revolves around thinking about this other person. What is he doing? What are his motivations? Codependents spend large amounts of time rescuing or covering up for the other person and fixing it. So engaging in this codependent behavior. And the codependent gets exhausted taking care of the other person, but cannot stop because they rely on the other person to tell them they're okay. So they're recovering from the behavior, and they can't seem to get out of it, because if I don't do this, then I'm not okay. If this person is not there to validate me, then I kind of disappear. So real weak ego strength. Foregoing other interests in order to maintain the addiction. So the relationship is the drug of choice in the codependent's lives. Having that person in their life makes them feel okay or whole. And the relationship takes the place of self-love. So we see, a huge glaring sign here of a step that we can take in treatment is helping clients develop self-esteem and the ability to love themselves and not rely on other people to say, you know what, you're okay. We need you in this world. They can look in the mirror and go, the world needs me, thank you very much. Continuing the addiction or the relationship despite negative consequences, emotional consequences. A person who's codependent experiences frequent bouts with depression, anxiety, anger, and resentment, especially when they can't control the other person or when the other person is not doing well. Social consequences can include loss of other friends, because sometimes friends will see what's going on and go, Sally, this is really not helpful to you right now. This is not healthy. And this is not helpful to the other person either, potentially. And eventually friends may back away, because codependents tend to take sort of a martyr position sometimes. And sometimes friends get tired of that, going, well, eventually friends get to the point where they're saying, you stayed in the situation. I don't know what you want me to say. Physical consequences of codependency, stress-related physical issues. And we know that there's a myriad of those. And occupational. The codependent is going to call in sick to take care of the alcoholic who's hungover. The codependent is probably going to have poor job performance because they're focused on the addict who is not in their direct presence. The codependent is going to suffer in their job performance because they're plumb exhausted from worrying about the person with the addiction. So you can see, all the prime characteristics of a substance use disorder can be applied to codependency and these relationships. They can be very, very toxic. So what is similar between addicts and codependents? Because you would say, well, what's the function of the addiction? What's it doing for the person? Or, what sorts of issues might this person be dealing with? And we find that the issues that are similar between addicts and codependents, with a few exceptions. So both have low self-esteem. Most people with addictions tend to feel ashamed, feel like they're not worthy. I don't think I've ever met a person with a full-blown addiction that truly feels all that good about themselves. They may be very successful in certain things, but they may also recognize that they're not living the kind of life they want to. Both tend to struggle with depression and anxiety and a need to control. So we can help people develop distress tolerance skills. We can help them address cognitive distortions. We can help them work with radical acceptance. And we can help them use techniques such as acceptance and commitment therapy to address their need to control everything. They need to start learning what things they can control, what things they can't control, and how to cope with those things that are out of their control. So when Jim Bob goes out and drinks all night long, even though you told him not to, you feel angry and resentful. You couldn't control that behavior. How do you deal with that? Because you can't control another person. How do you deal with it so it doesn't destroy you? Both struggle with fear of abandonment. It's really a common theme in people with addictions as well as people with codependency issues, that they don't feel, because their self-esteem is low, they tend to need other people to validate them. And if they don't have other people validating them, then they kind of feel like they cease to be, or they feel unworthy. So they need to be surrounded. And when people disagree with them or when people leave, that abandonment is almost like ripping a part of their heart out. Relationships often comfort and numb, in codependency especially, but sometimes in addiction. I see a ton of unhealthy relationships that are based a lot of times on merely physical presence and sexual involvement in order to comfort themselves. I can tell you stories after working on a co-educational unit for 20 years about the lengths people will go to for relationships. The relationship becomes the addict's primary focus. So this is true with codependents. With people with addictions, if they're blocked from their primary addictions, such as in treatment, we can quickly see them moving into focusing on a person and or sex. Minimizing, denying, and blaming to protect the relationship. I've seen people with addictions use all of these: minimize how bad their problem is, deny they have a problem, blame others. I wouldn't have to drink, I wouldn't have to use. But we also see this in codependency. They minimize the impact that the relationship is having on them. They're like, it's not that big of a deal. They deny that the person with the addiction is or this relationship is not helpful, and they tend to blame others. Well, if you would help me with this person, or blame the person, if you would do the next right thing and get better, then I wouldn't have to take care of you. So there's a lot of throwing focus, throwing blame instead of taking responsibility. A lot of stinking thinking in both. And if you're not familiar with this term, that's really cognitive distortions. Global negative internal attributions. The world is against me. What the DSM-5 tends to refer to as neurotic behavior.